Welcome to all of you to today's thesis prep lecture by Sylvia Lavin. This is the fourth lecture that has been organized this spring. The first one was Axel Killian talking about technology and architecture. We had Marion Weiss talking about city and architecture. Jode talked to us about diagram, and today Sylvia will talk to us about the relationship between art and architecture. I first got to know Sylvia in her capacity as a chair of UCLA in 1997. I was an engineering exchange student from Bologna, and she was the newly appointed chair of the architectural department, which she reshaped during her two terms from 1996 to 2006. When I arrived at UCLA, I did not know much about architecture, but in my naivete, I knew enough to foresee that something very important was about to happen under her. And luckily, she gave me the chance to pursue an education in the department. I'm mentioning this because today, Tom and I are doing all the process of admission at UCLA at SCI-Arc, and I think each time I have the honor to offer a scholarship to an entering student, I remember her generosity towards me, and I can help think that 20 years later, I'm fortunate enough to be able to give back one of the most precious gifts I ever received, the chance to get an education that I so much desired. So thank you for that. Nobody more than me knows firsthand how the support of an institution, and in my case a person, can change the direction of a young individual career. And it's because of her example, her fearlessness, her intellectual strength, that I grew into the position I'm in today. During my time as a student at UCLA, I had as professor every architect who won or was about to win the Pritzker Prize. Tom Mayne, Toyo Ito, Zaha Hadid, Glenn Marcotte, Peter Eisenman, and more, Wolf Prix, Greg Lynn, Mark Lynn. UCLA is where I met Jeff Kipnis and Bob Somo. Making a list of personalities is silly, but worth mentioning because it's a testament to her ability to lead architectural discourse globally. I will share with you an anecdote. I remember being in line for hours with my sister to attend the lecture of Rem Koolhaas at UCLA, where Sylvia orchestrated the presence of a diverse group of people. Next to Rem, Martha Stewart, and in the audience, a man that I mistook for a homeless, a handsome homeless, I have to say. And after a while, I realized that it was Brad Pitt in disguise. I'm mentioning this because besides the star architects that have been orbiting around our planet for years, in time, I realized how Sylvia not only connects dots, but her theories create new stellar maps. Kissing Architecture, which I think is in every single desk here at SCI-Arc, I saw you signing a book, explores the relationship between architecture and other forms of contemporary art, putting perception, experience, and subjectivity at the center of her thinking about our field. Lavin shows how surfaces, colors, installations are able to give a building the capacity of acting upon us through sensation and affect. Her book, The Flesh and the Pen and Other Forms of Architectural Contemporaneity, is centered on the now, the new, and the ephemeral, words that have more weight than gravity in a school like ours. At the same time, her insight on contemporary architecture draws upon a rich and rigorous historical research. One of Lavin's most significant publications, Form Follows Libido, examines Richard Neutra through a psychoanalytic lens. She spans a very broad historical spectrum and covers a conspicuous intellectual territory. She's currently the director of the Critical Studies and PhD at UCLA. She has taught at Princeton, Harvard, Columbia, and numerous other institutions, and she has been recognized by many grants and awards, among them the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Getty Research Institute, and the Grant Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Sylvia Lavin on stage.
It's a rare moment where you feel that all the work you do as a teacher is worth it. So I'm very proud of you. Okay, so first of all kinds of apologies, because I actually totally didn't understand what today was. And so those of you who are not actually doing thesis are welcome to leave. Like no hurt feelings or anything, because this is super informal and really like I imagined it, a class rather than a lecture. So I think of this as very pedagogical. What I'm going to say is extremely pedagogical, and also pedagogical in the sense that I myself was given an assignment, and my assignment was to talk about art and thesis. Probably not where I would start had I not been given an assignment, but my first lesson to you all students is do what you're told up to a point, and that was my assignment, and I will try to execute it as best as I can. Which is to say that I don't make any assumptions that a thesis has to be about art, or rather that a good thesis is about art, or that doing a thesis about art is a good idea, but rather that that's a kind of proposition that we might think about. So maybe instruction number one about if you want to do a thesis about art, probably the first thing to do is to go out and look at some art, which is to say, you know, if you want to be a good writer, be a good reader, if you want to, like that kind of thing. And so I'm just showing you here two things that I saw for the first time relatively recently, because I went to the Hammer and looked at some art, and I'm sure a lot of you were there or have been to see the exhibitions that are up at the Hammer right now. And I came away very struck by these two works in particular. So, you know, one of them I knew before, one of them I didn't know before. I don't totally know why I was, you know, I have some thoughts about why I was interested in them. But I'm telling you this story because I couldn't have presented these two images to you more than 2 weeks ago. So, I don't know, 5 years ago, I went, whatever it was, I went to MoMA. There was a thing by Pipi Rist, and I had some kind of thought about that. And now I went and I saw these, and I'm having a different kind of thought. Part of what I'm trying to say is that the relationship between art and architecture is historical. It's not abstract, it's not a priori, it's very particular. New art gets made, and therefore one's understanding of the relationship between art and architecture is going to change. One's historical situation changes, and therefore what you see changes as well. So I think trying to think historically is very important. So one of the things that you might ask yourself while you're learning to be a good person who's interested in art by looking at art is wondering why something is of interest to you today. And I'll maybe try to get back to why I've been thinking about why these came to be of interest to me today, and maybe I'll say something about that at the end, but really it's the question that's more important than the particularity. The other thing that I wanted to say is that, of course, the interest in the problem or defining the relationship between art and architecture as a problem is also historical. So, of course, there's a long history of the relationship. Let's say we could begin it in the Renaissance when perspective becomes a thing shared by artists and architects. But I wouldn't describe the problem with Pier della Francesca as a problem. Right? It wasn't a problem. It was a mode of practice. I'm sure that you know that many painters were architects and architects were painters, and they slipped around and tried to figure out what, the problem, if there was one, was the rationalization and the production of a kind of consistency of the optical field. This was not understood to be an architectural problem or a painting problem. It was a different kind of situation. If you move into the 18th century, so of course the Laocoon is not an 18th century work, but the discourses around the Laocoon are from the 18th century. And it's at this moment where really what we would later call mediums start to speciate and differentiate. So painting gets described in certain terms, sculpture gets described in other terms, architecture gets described in other terms. I still would not describe their relationship as a problem. It was not, if you look in the 18th century, nobody is working on what is the relationship between art and architecture. Not a problem. Other things, which is better, art or architecture, that's something. We might think about that as a kind of thing that hangs around, but certainly not a problem. In the 19th century, I don't know, we're maybe inching up to a problem. This is Viollet-le-Duc using watercolor techniques to look at the Alps. By now, we understand vision is emerging as a system of knowledge production. Science, natural science, geography, painting, all sorts of things are trying to describe a visual language as accurate and precise. I would probably say that this question of accuracy and precision in the visual field was more the problem. It was not a problem to use pictorial techniques as an architect. Again, not yet a problem. More interesting for Viollet-le-Duc was whether a mountain was a building. So in that moment, you probably would have said, if you were doing a thesis, what is the relationship between architecture and geology? Not sure why we don't do that now, but maybe next year that could be another kind of thesis. I guess I would say when you look at his crazy, when he retired, he went off to Lausanne and lived in here and took his Alps with him and put him around him. You know this image. But if you look at the crazy way the doors intersected the panorama, this is just my way of saying this was not a problem for him. The intersection between the architectural elements like doors and windows and the pictorial landscape was just simply not a problem, or he would have solved it. Right? So we need to think historically about this in order to be able to understand how we think about it today. So a certain shift, I would say, begins in the 20th century. We can find lots of places to read it, but maybe with something like this work by Duchamp, because now he's actually borrowing what we might think of as architectural materials. So plumbing didn't really belong to anybody, but if it belonged to anybody, it belonged more to architects than it belonged to, say, painters. So a new problem starts to emerge, as we can see in this work, which is a kind of loss of identity of what the category of art itself is. Right? So I don't think Duchamp is working on the relationship between plumbing and architecture and sculpture. He's working on the category of art. So by the time we get here, a kind of sort of things that have been developing since the 18th century, the kind of critique of the aristocracy of taste, the critique of the idea of genius and talent, which is to say a kind of democratization of the idea of creativity. All of these things start to press on the problem of art as a particular form of production. Pressures of industrial production. These are all things that you know perfectly well. But what I'm trying to suggest is that thinking of the relationship between art and architecture as a problem, which is to say as a problematic, which is to say as something that can't be solved, is not an ahistorical problem. It's a problem of modernity. And it's a problem of specific aspects of modernity, which are the pressures on the category of art itself. So we see these kinds of pressures begin here. We might look at the work of somebody like Le Corbusier as an effort to, I would probably call it stave off this problem. I don't think he's solving it. I think he's trying to produce a system of deferral. So he takes all of those everyday objects, the non-art objects that Duchamp put on the pedestal, and turns them into painting, sort of capturing them back from the everyday world to try to make sure that art remains art in some way. One of the things that really fascinates me about Corb is that he always signed his paintings with a different name than he used for his architecture, which is to say the relationship between them is still not really a problem, or it's a problem that is to be solved by differentiation and a kind of radical distinction. Again, you could start to use this as a sort of hunt for cracks in this problem. So if you look at the Esprit Nouveau pavilion, it's by him, but he puts up works by himself on the wall. I find that sort of bizarre, So one is Corb and the other is Generet, and I don't know, is it equipment or is it not equipment? It's kind of a multiple personality disorder starts to enter here. The fiction of one as an artist and one as an architect starts to kind of become unglued, if you will. You might start to think about other kinds of words that Corb used, like equipment. So is painting equipment? The minute we start thinking about painting as equipment, then it stops being painting. And so all of these things are let's say, circulating around. But the edges that they're circulating around at this point are still not exactly the relationship between art and architecture, but rather the edges of the category of culture itself, trying to find ways to both establish and undo let's say, cultural production from other forms of industrial production. There are a million sort of classic episodes in the progressive collapse of these regimes, let's say collapse of ontological clarity. A good example is Mondrian's studio. So, Mondrian starts with little paintings of the landscape, and the paintings become more and more abstract, and the paintings get a little bit bigger, and the edges of the painting become less clear as he starts to wrap the canvas around the edge of and then he goes to New York, and the painting starts to move onto the wall, and then all of a sudden the studio is the painting or not, right? So that we start to get in these moments a kind of the beginnings of a lack of distinction, both materially and conceptually, between what is the everyday world and what is the work. And it's really that distinction that starts, I would say, to become a problem. That's the problem. What is the world and what is not of the world? A well-known moment of, I don't know, what would I put it? Like a brink that you can't get back from. This is like the biting of the apple. Like once this apple is bit, you can never unbite it again. So by here, this is Tomorrow exhibition of 1956, the poster by Hamilton and the Patio Pavilion by the Smithsons. By now you have painters making paintings out of architectural elements, and you have architects making art in the shape of building. Right, so at this particular moment, the difference between the world and art has really collapsed, and one of the forms that it takes is a lack of clarity about the difference between the category art and the category architecture. I will say that this problem has haunted architects more than it has haunted visual artists. So this is your problem, it's not their problem. And I think that's also worth thinking about. There are some reasons for that. One of them has to do with what I mentioned before, which is to say that the art side of the equation from the 18th century had a higher status. So if you're going to try to decide who wants to be like whom, the architects generally wanted to be like the artists. They got paid more. Very simple. They got paid more. They still get paid more. Like if you were to just take like an hourly rate of a successful architect and a successful painter, the painter makes more. So the economies of this distinction are quite significant. There are moments in which artists envy architects, and that's also something interesting to think about. Why do they envy architecture? What does architecture represent for the artist? It probably has something to do with like being in the real world, like not being art, right? So artists like architecture because it's not art, and architects like artists because they think that it is. So in an image like this, this is the Venturi Best Products showroom shortly before it was to come down. I'm kind of riveted by this picture that was taken by a photographer who happened to go by. This is not like a setup by, you'd think that the Venturi set this up, but in fact not. And so when you look at this, it's actually hard to tell which is the art and which is not. You know, I don't know, do we think of the panorama on the truck as a painting, or is it the building? And so something about this suggests this kind of concern that architects have that their work is more easily sucked back into the vernacular landscape of the real world than other things, and needs a kind of framing systems to make it appear to make it appear particular. So, which is to say, I think architects are more interested in the art-architecture relationship than artists are, because architects are more worried about collapsing into the state of the everyday. So the thesis and so forth around this, I think, is a bit of a let's say, crutch to defer that problem. Okay, so trying to make a step one of the historical argument is that the art-architecture problem is a problem that emerged historically under very particular circumstances, has as its underlying set of conditions, problems of forms of production, forms of kind of definitions of the human, all sorts of things that call the category of art into crisis, and it's at that moment basically in the immediate post-war world that this becomes a problem. I say that because I want to call attention to the fact that that historical emergence coincides with, was generated by the same kinds of conditions, a new chapter in the history of thesis making specifically. So in the first, every thesis has been around for a long time. If you look at most schools and the kinds of thesis work that they did before mid-century, the thesis was more or less modeled on professional practice. So a thesis was a kind of building project. It was the thing that produced professional competence. And around this moment, the problem that we've been talking about becomes the topic for thesis making. Probably at no place with more celebration and more aplomb than at the Cooper Union in New York. This is Hayek. They're critiquing thesis students. So the kind of thesis work that a lot of you are working on is not an ahistorical thesis project, but it's a thesis project that really begins specifically in the post-war, and at least a lot of the students that I spoke to this morning, it actually begins with here, like literally here at the Cooper Union and Slutsky and transparency and this whole kind of problem. I think it's important to try to think about that because thesis work at that moment was beginning to enter the academy. This is a particular academy, but it was as it was entering the academy in ways that wanted to distance itself from just professional practice. It picked up certain modes of working that were really based on the sciences, which is to say that a thesis was the statement of a problem which was then going to be solved. We still use this vocabulary. The vocabulary didn't exist before, and that vocabulary is a vocabulary that came out of the notion of a scientific method where a progressive teleological advancement of knowledge would be produced. So thesis at this point took on certain, let's say, pretensions and aspirations. Its pretensions were to operate like a science, that you could move forward in a progressive and positivist way. And also, instead of just forming a kind of professional competency, it started to have the ambition of actually producing knowledge. And in the need to produce knowledge as opposed to just professional competency, it needed also to produce forms of representation, forms of rhetoric, forms of justification in which through which that knowledge could be evaluated and valorized. So if we take something like the corner problem, which you probably learned in some class, and it was probably presented to you as the corner problem, and you've seen people do thesis work on the corner problem, you might think for a moment that the corner problem was an invention of the Renaissance, because that's probably where you saw the corner problem performed. And we could probably together share, we could walk through, the Cancelleria to here, to doodly-doo, until we have the solution of the corner problem, like in Venice or something like that. So what I'm trying to say is that the corner problem is not a problem of the Renaissance. The corner problem was invented by art historians in the 1950s, turning the history of architecture into a positivist form of knowledge that one could describe in terms of problem solving. Which is to say, once we understand it that way, we can choose to kind of repeat that performance or not. I would say that somebody like Danny Libeskind chose to perform that problem and chose to perform it maybe like again and again and again, right? So every time that we look at Danny Libeskind work, we are repeating in an updated, abstracted way the corner problem. Right, so in this case, it's has to do with the representation of three-dimensional surfaces on a flat plane and issues of complexity and so forth, and they get stated in a certain way. By the way, in his thesis project, right? This is his thesis project at Cooper Union. And then you can produce a history of his work in which this problem of representation and flat versus deep and a lot of the things that you all have been talking to me about this morning and perception and so on and so forth gets pursued and gets increasingly, let's say, solved, right? So here we would say that the complexity is both intensified and simplified at the same time, right? So we have, if you look at this one, kind of uneven. Right, the surface is irregular. Some parts are more complex than others. In some parts, we see the problem of the three dimensions versus the flat more acutely. Here, this is producing a kind of more overall treatment of the plane, so it's both more complex and more simple at the same time. And then if we go on to this, we see that this problem of the representation of three dimensions on a flat surface is now adapting itself to be represented actually on a three-dimensional surface, and therefore then has made a kind of advancement. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we see in something like Libeskind's work the convergence of two different things. We see the convergence of the problem of art and architecture and the problem of thesis as a pedagogical model. Those two things join in my little mock history here. They join into a superstructure, and this superstructure is kind of where we begin, or where my assignment, I think, began, to come and talk to you about art and thesis work. One of the things that I would say about this problem, or not recognizing the history of this issue, is that one of the things that happens with Libeskind, I'm not blaming Libeskind, by the way, or not totally, but what happens around this moment is that something that maybe I would call the relationship between subtext and pretext gets forgotten. So if the subtext is, we don't really know what architecture is anymore, so if you were to look back at the discourses around architecture from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, one of the new topics that was the most emphatic were these constant circulations around architecture, not architecture, discipline, profession, building versus architecture, a kind of hysterical outpouring of anxiety about the loss of distinction of what architecture was, which produced an over-attachment to a kind of hypothetical, artificial definition of what architecture is. This is what I find a little bit jarring about this, which is that it has, I would say, forgotten that its pretext, complexity, surface representation, flat space, and so forth, is in fact a pretext for a subtext. So I'll try to show you a little bit more about what I mean as I go on. But by now, in the world of Cooper Union, it was actually not even possible to recognize that this was a pretext. This simply was architecture. And anything that didn't take on these questions of abstract systems of representation and formal manipulation and complexity, and et cetera, got rejected by being referred to as not about architecture. So we hear that constantly. All of those people that I had come and do the Pritzker-Dooley things at UCLA back in the day, probably the one thing they had in common was a set of blinders about what architecture was and what it was not. And I'm just saying, right here, these are the blinders in formation. So it's so great that we now get, that we had that fantastic 30 years of living in the blinders. I don't know whether anybody here gets car sickness or is like a bad passenger. I'm a terrible passenger. I'm that person in the front seat of the car, like put my feet up on, like if you're not braking enough, I'm braking for you. You're turning this way, I'm like screaming. I am like the worst. So what they tell you to do now is they tell you to put on like a scarf so you have no peripheral vision, so you can't see. Okay, so it's fantastic. You don't get scared. You don't get to, it's like, okay. So that world was this. It was fantastic. I loved every minute of it. And somehow, like, I don't have things happen. This is a little bit what I mean about the historicity of these questions. Okay, so a little bit now I'm going to talk about the world in those blinders, because it's a good world. It's worth occupying a little bit. And I would say that in that world, there have been sort of three principal channels. And again, please remember, I'm being super pedagogical. I'm thinking about the students I saw this morning and the students I'm going to see this afternoon, and you might identify which of these models you think that you belong to. But the first model of thinking through this problem, which is now a problem, and thinking about it in relation to thesis, and constructing the blinders that make it possible to articulate the problem in that way. One of them is what I would call emulation. Emulation is the oldest form of aesthetic pedagogy. Emulate basically means to copy a positive model. So in the context of the history of the École des Beaux-Arts and things like that, learning was always about copying a model that was better than you. So let's just say that we have a kind of logic of emulation. This logic of emulation generally is still predicated on a very 18th century hierarchy of the arts that tends to place painting at the top. So what painting gets to do is articulate the problem. Makes the first pass, and what other people do is then try to emulate the problematic articulated by painting. This would be the Slutsky, right? So we start with Gris, who does whatever he does, and then we have we have Michael Graves, who tries to enter the logic of painting, and then he pursues the logic of painting, so it becomes even more painterly than any kind of a painting, and then he's very careful to make sure that he gets himself represented as a painter whenever possible, right? So this is a kind of model of emulation. Emulation, particularly in the Cooper universe, is not just based on painting as model, but based on a certain form of discourse about painting, itself modeled on the discourses of Clement Greenberg. So it's Greenberg who establishes what painting discourse is and how it progresses through increasing forms of abstraction. So when we look at Michael Graves, it's not just that he's emulating painting, he's emulating Greenberg's analysis of painting that needs to move towards increasingly forms of abstraction. So I would say that if we look at Liszewski, and I mean, you know all of these connections, but I think I would just say that we're looking at very similar modes of operation. So the painting comes first, becomes a model of emulation. It gets turned into a problematic that then gets explored in architectural terms. And if you're super clever like Zaha, you figure out how to articulate that through painting, right? So Michael never, it was really funny, he never totally figured that out. I just had an interesting conversation with the guy who built this house. And this is the Banastroff house in Princeton, New Jersey. And Paul Banastroff turns out to have been like a super interesting guy. He's the guy, there's some students this morning who were talking about feminism in architecture. Paul Banastroff is the guy that brought women to Princeton. And one of the funny, I'm really off topic here, but it's kind of a good story. So this house very recently, not so recently, whatever, it just collapsed. Paul Banastroff said the reason that it collapsed was that he was so busy trying to get women into Princeton that he wasn't actually paying any attention to the fact that it was built with spit and bubble gum, and Michael wasn't either. Okay, but this is what, I don't know why I found this so funny. Michael offered to give the Banastroffs some murals, to paint murals for them in the house. And they said, no, thank you. So I would say Zaha figured out how not to get turned down by doing the thing on painting in the first place. Anyway, we could, there would be like a whole kind of story we could tell about that. So while it's a little bit easy to sort of poke at those slightly older models or older examples, I just want to say that this model is alive and well, and even in circles that you don't always suspect, right? So I would say that even though we think of Koolhaas as operating according to a different model, actually here we have emulation, problem statement by painting, translated into architectural terms in a kind, like that. Okay, so there's that. As art in its teleological way unfold, architects continue the question of emulation, but then they start to substitute new art forms to play the role of model. So if we think about the development of performance art or the technical arts and film and so forth, what really begins to shift with somebody like Bernard Tschumi is not the structure of the relationship, but the object that is to be emulated. So here we have Longo, who's already doing a whole series of problems of translation, or, but these kinds of characters of the city, understanding the city as a series of stock characters that are performing in a filmic way. It's still, I would say, a model of emulation, although the object of emulation shifts. Again, you can plug, if this is a bit of a formula, you can plug all kinds of new things into the beginning of the algorithm, and you will get different things at the end. I picked this one because Warhol's Silver Clouds, he described it as his goodbye to painting. So we can emulate goodbye to painting also, and we can continue the notion that you would push the emulation in a kind of positivist model of progressive research. So we take many clouds and we make them one. We take a floating clouds out the window and make them seem more extreme by compressing the space. And then finally you get rid of the cloud altogether and you have a kind of pure articulation of goodbye architecture, right? So this would be, this kind of model. You can be a Peter Eisenman and you can start with a conceptual model, but you know all of these things. I think I'm just trying to indicate that in all of these things we have an emulation of something that gets started as a model, as a positive model to be lived up to, if you will, and a model of research that moves the work forward in a particular way. So we start with house one, and the thing is simple, and then it becomes more and more complex. Okay, The second model, if emulation is one, not model, if emulation is one track, maybe I would call the second track I'm going to just talk about briefly. I don't really have a good word for it, but I'll call it critique because it's not a loaded word at all. So here I would say this is maybe an example where there's a kind of reversal. So Richard Serra is going, if Michael Graves worked hard to try to be a painter, to look like a painter, to give away paintings, to be painterly, all of those kinds of things. Richard Serra is producing a very different affect of a worker, and not just any worker, of a construction laborer, somebody who is engaged in the building process, in the kind of architectural process, kind of in reverse, if you will. So you see this kind of reversal in the rise of sculpture, and the rise of sculpture that now is looking at architecture for its materials and even some of its formal characteristics. If the kind of ghostly guide, if you will, of the painterly emulation problem is Greenberg, I would say that the ghostly guide of the critique problem is probably somebody like Yvain Lambois. Maybe you read Yvain Lambois here, maybe a little bit less in Greenberg. I found a little bit less of that this morning. But anyway, you might look at his work. One of the things that he describes the relationship between sculpture and architecture at this moment as not a problem of emulation, but as a problem of isomorphism, which is to say two things beginning to look alike, and through the dissimulation of that appearance, masking certain kinds of differences that you can't necessarily see in the work, that you would have to look at in other ways. And Bois' argument was that the isomorphism, that they start to look the same, is fundamental to the birth of a notion of critique, because he argues you have to get close enough to the other to be able to produce pushback, to be able to articulate differences, and therefore a kind of critical resistance. This is his vocabulary. So, we could look at all of the Serras and what they're looking at, but what Bois really points attention to is the need to look at ways of working. So his fundamental argument about the difference between sculpture, art generally, and architecture in this period is that architects work in one way and artists work in another. But please understand, he's kind of totally making this up, right? This is the argument, but I'm just trying to tell you what the argument. So his argument is that architects work in plan. And plan is a controlling mechanism that controls the viewer and the person in space, and therefore architecture is always a system of control. You might think about architects like Wolf Prix, who in this very period, what he says about his work of this period was that they never drew it in plan, right? So in not drawing in plan, he's engaging procedurally the kind of argument that Bois would be making. And he then talks about Serra as somebody who never drew in plan and always drew in perspective, or, this is the whole parallax thing and so forth. I guess when I say it's like bullshit, you don't get this kind of steel, and somebody drew a plan, and even if Serra had somebody else draw, this is all rhetorical. But nevertheless, this is the rhetoric of the period. So we might look at these moments where things start to look very much alike and try to find in these moments of isomorphisms ways of pointing to, ways of working that produce critique and differentiation. This is just one of these crazy drawings by Ed Rachet. So in one of his many books of this period, he went around and took photos of dingbat apartment buildings around LA, that they're already pretty amazing. But then what's more amazing is the fact that he had to draw his photographs of the dingbat apartments in order to make sure, right? So he produces a drawing after the fact to articulate that it's really not like architecture. You might try to think about the modes of production that lead to the Rachet and that lead to the Gehry. Sadly, this building was recently torn down. It doesn't exist anymore. One of the kind of amazing buildings that some of us, drove by 1,000 times and literally never saw. Maybe one of the most successful buildings at achieving invisibility that I can imagine. You know, I don't know, is it the invisibility that led to having it be torn down? Is that a form of success or a form of failure? I'm not entirely sure. So anyway, we could then kind of prance through a history of this isomorphic critique. We might think of, say, Bruce Nauman, you know, becoming Sejima, trying to think about what the different modes of operation here are, something that is like a building but not a building, something that gets actually inserted into a building. And a whole new vocabulary, a form of blinders, if you will, starts to emerge in the vocabulary of actuality, experience, and environment. Right? So part of what people are doing now is trying to shift the focus of art to, say, real situations. So this is Peter Alexander making an actual environment, making a house that is an environment. We could look at Hans Haacke describing the museum as an environment. You know, this would just be another way of setting up these kinds of parallels, and you would probably start to think about them in terms of ways of working. So stacking and stacking, for example, or cleaning, organizing, rationalizing, cleaning, organizing, and rationalizing. You know, here we get photo documents, here we get photo documents and drawings, so I don't know, maybe Bois is right, and architects can't not draw. Not entirely sure. So if we have emulation as one category, critique as another category, I think more recently an emulation has to do with these hierarchies and modes of research, and critique has to do with isomorphism and ways of working. We might think of, this one just sort of amuses me, this is a Nauman little building. It was actually a little building, and this is how he got it built. You know, the wall should be 6 inches thick. That's it. So, you know, then we would have to look at what an architect would have to do to get this to this, and then you have to decide if you're interested in those differences, maybe or not. And so there's a whole other thing that we could look at about the interest in the ways of working. Okay, so ways of working in sculpture and critique and emulation and forms of research and so forth. So I guess the more recent category that belongs to neither of those, although it shares properties with both, would be what we might call superproduction. I haven't decided on what a good word for it is, but somebody like Olafur Eliasson might be, he certainly is a super producer. And one of the ways we might think about his super production, his overproduction, is that he sort of produces the same thing again and again and again and again in a different format. So sometimes it takes the pavilion format, sometimes it takes a work format, sometimes it takes a working method format. So this is his studio. For those of you who are Olafur followers on Instagram, you know, it's super interesting that there are probably more pictures of him at work in his studio than there are pictures of his work. So the kind of staging of the work in the studio is clear that the studio is itself a work. Food, cookbooks, what they eat, what they grow, what they wear, like every single one is a kind of world in and of itself that he makes again and again and again and again. So there's something weirdly godlike in his self-image, like he's a world maker, and he makes it. He makes the sun, he makes the plants, he makes it. Okay, but I mean, this kind of idea that you would make the world, which is to say that you don't make a thing, that you use things to make worlds, I think is the ambition of the super producer. And they're trying to think about different, let's say, formats for world making. a meal makes a world in one way, a building makes it in another way, a light bulb makes it in another way. Each one of these are being thought about not so much as an object, but in terms of the effects on the world that it produces. So Oliver may be an extreme example. I don't know whether you would think of him as like a model to emulate or critique, but nevertheless, I think it's a structure of thinking about art and architecture that thinks about the world and how to make it. This is their food thing. We can think of other world makers. I would say Thomas Demand is a world maker. He takes things from the world, like photos, and then remakes them as little worlds. I mean, these paper models that he makes of the world, and then he photographs the world. And so each one of these are kinds of, I don't know. I don't know what his Trump thing is going to be, but I'm sure he's going to do. I'm sure he's going to do one. I don't know what it will look like. What it would look like now. So formatting would be a word. So if we have emulation in Greenberg and we have critique and Bois, we might think of formatting superproduction and somebody like David Joslet. That's somebody that people read a lot. And the question of the format and how, in fact, art or architecture are not things, they're just a system for organizing information in a particular way. And that you might want to format some information in architectural terms if you want to affect the world in one way, and you might format the same information in another way if you have different kinds of ambitions. So because I know that you know that I think about P.P. Riester, or have a little bit, I was super, how can you not love dirty underwear that's all like pink and pretty? And how can you not love it, especially when it's in Peter Eisenman's Wexner Center, and it's kind of literally bleeding all over the place without any limit. The Wexner Center is kind of never the same again, right? It's like totally transformed. It's a world transformed by this work. So even though she's a little bit more object-oriented than some of the others, I would still think of P.P. Riester as somebody who's a kind of imagines what she does as a world maker, and architecture is just one of the formats that it might use. I'm concluding now. I think I have I can conclude, right? I feel as though I was supposed to talk for a certain number of minutes and then I can be done. Okay, so I'm going to be didactic again and conclude. So we have every thesis, I think, has a subtext. Every thesis that takes on the question of art has a subtext, whether it's aware of it or not. And the subtext is the problem of the definition of architecture and its reliance on some category of art in order to prove and valorize the existence of the category of architecture. I would say the more explicit, the more often you can remind yourself that that's the subtext, the better off you'll be. The relationship between art and architecture is just a pretext for dealing with that subtext. So you design your pretext in order to work on the subtext. You've got different ways of doing that. You can make them match, you can make them not match, but I think that most of the thesis projects that I heard started with the subtext and started with the pretext and allowed the subtext to go unstated. I would encourage you not to do that. In fact, I would go so far as to say a good thesis is one that has a very strategic way of managing the relationship between the subtext and the pretext. The three that I have laid out, they're just the most historical and obvious, are systems of emulation, systems of critique, and systems of superproduction. These are just tropes. They have no intrinsic character. They just have a lot of traction, which you can borrow or not, depending on how it is that you want to operate. So I guess I would just end, why was I interested in these particular works all of a sudden? Why was I distracted from the pink lights of P.P. Riester to look at these things? They're both collections. They're both, so we have collections of weird things and collections of butterfly wings. And they make wholes, like collections are always trying to make wholes. They're trying to make like whole worlds, and I started thinking about what is this world that they're trying to make. I began to realize that I had to think in order to try to think through these works. I couldn't stop at the work, so I wondered, how did Dubuffet get all those butterfly wings? Like, was the guy a serial killer sitting around plucking the wings off butterfly? He made many of these. Like, really, where the fuck do you get all those butterflies? It's like diabolically, it's horrifying. It's and then it's so fantastically pretty and horrifying. And where do the butterfly wings come from? And okay, and so then this is there are things going on here like collecting, assembling, classifying, certain kinds of activities that I realized, oh, these are very traditional forms of architectural activity. Collecting, classifying, sorting, organizing, world making, taking things from the world and shifting their categories into these things, and so forth. And so then I started thinking, well, could I make an alternative genealogy of works that might also be organized around these kinds of activities? This is just, I don't know, I have my new favorites. So 10 years ago, it might have been Pippi Rist, and now it's this. Like so these are all, if you don't know this work, which is called Found Dope. There are a series of them. This one happens to be Found Dope Part 2. These are all the little tips of crack vials. This incredible array of little plastic moments of dystopian joy that are like everywhere. And the work is like meticulous. It's only an architect could do that, right? She's not an architect, but it's so architectural, mapping, data collecting, but where she was when she found the thing and it's like so kind of unbelievable. Traveling, mapping, measuring, collecting, organizing, describing a world order that really I wouldn't have been able to think of before, and producing a kind of system of representation that I think has much, much more in common with architectural systems of representation than it does with painting and so forth. So this might be a way of world making that, okay, so here are my 5 lessons to end with, right? So go look at art, right? Pay attention to why you like what and what's new. 2, understand the effects on your thinking of the various topoi that I have described. Right? So you enter a discussion that is already taking place. That discussion is going to predetermine up to a point the blinders that you have. You have every right to keep on the blinders. I don't like to get carsick, but you can't pretend that they're not there. So you have to have a way of thinking about that. Test your understanding of these blinders by seeing if you can articulate what your subtext is and differentiate it from your pretext. Right? You always know what those 2 things are and how you are managing them. My last 2, if I were doing thesis, I would give you 2 other very explicit assignments. One is that I would ask you to write a grant application to seek money in support of your work. And so there would be certain, again, to be very pedagogical, although Elena said she gave out money as a fellowship, scholarship, thank you very much. I'm assuming that if you want some real money, you're going to have to leave SCI-Arc to get it. You're going to have to ask somebody else for some money. So this, I would say, is a very healthy thing. Figure out a way to make your discourse translate outside of the immediate world that you're in. Make sure it's portable. Make sure it communicates in other worlds and makes worlds, and justify what it is that you're doing. So, and even just to look at what a grant application would require you to say about your work, right? So you could try the GRAM, low-hanging fruit. Very low-hanging fruit, right? It's a good exercise, but they ask you to do certain kinds of things. See if you can do that with your thesis. I think the biggest grant that the GRAM gives is maybe $10,000, $12,000, $15,000, a little bit more, like on a non-institutional level. If you want real money, like big money, you have to apply to the National Institute of Science, for example. And if there you can get millions, like really millions. So the status now issue is not like how to become a painter. The status issue now is how to apply for a grant from the National Institute of Science. Okay, just as an exercise. One thing that you'll find is that probably as an architect, you cannot be the principal investigator. Right? So anyway, you would just have to start thinking about where you fit into other forms of knowledge making and what kind of vocabulary you would use. So my last exercise would be to ask you all to write a syllabus based on your thesis work, which is to say that thesis plays a very important role in transitioning you from people who are acquiring knowledge to people who are producing knowledge. So I, as a thesis juror, am not really interested in your bibliography. Like, I don't really care what you read to get where you are. I care what I have to read in order to understand what you've done. So at that moment where you need a syllabus, where you have something, a way to articulate what you have done as a form of knowledge that can be communicated to other people in a relatively systematic way, would be another way to test whether you have a good thesis, which I hope that you all will have, and I'm sure that you will. And maybe you could have a post-thesis curriculum in which we have classes taught by the students. I would come. Okay, thank you.